Apogee's first release in 1991 was Dark Ages by Scenario Software. This was the same studio as Monuments of Mars, but it's another title that doesn't make an appearance in the anthology. I'm fairly certain that this is the first Apogee game that I ever played. I would have been 7 or 8 years old at the time, and I remember writing countless essays and fanfiction of it in school and boring my teacher to death. As you can see, it's another side-scrolling platform game, but it doesn't look anywhere near as smooth as Commander Keen. The scrolling and movement are obviously based on a grid. The story goes that as the prince of something or other with mesmerisingly beefy legs, your quest is to free the kingdom from the evil wizard Garth and regain your rightful place on the throne. You do this by trekking through a kingdom full of dangerous creatures, feeding items to old men who then spontaneously combust, and gathering a variety of weapons such as these magic boomerangs. And if you can hear the sound in the background, it was the first Apogee game to feature ad-lib music alongside the PC speaker sound effects, and that's something that wouldn't be done by most other games for a while yet. Something interesting about Dark Ages is that it gives the impression of going through a continuous world instead of having distinct levels. You can see the seams, like when the maps swap around and cave in the wall behind you so that you can't return, but the attempt is generally quite good. A side effect of this approach is that it makes the game extremely unforgiving. It means you have to be very careful as you only have one life bar to last the entire game, and it can only be topped up very gradually by collecting coins or finding the slightly horrifying still beating hearts that you see lying around occasionally. The trilogy doesn't have a whole lot of variety to it. I've been showing clips from all 3 episodes while I've been talking here, but you'd be hard pressed to notice because they only have about 4 environments between them. Inside a castle, inside a cave, not inside either, and inside a disco that makes your eyeballs hurt. I didn't notice any new content when going through the registered episodes compared to the shareware one, in items, environment, or monsters. A walkthrough for the game might reasonably go something like moths, 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 spiders, moths, 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 eerily sentient boulder, moths. So Dark Ages was fascinating when I was much younger, but it doesn't really capture my imagination 23 years on. Let's move on before I get too depressed about that time span. July 1991 saw the birth of one of Apogee's most recognisable characters, although at this stage he wasn't a walking pile of steroids and laughable male power fantasies so much as a man in a pink tank top who wanted to save the world and get back to Earth in time to watch Oprah. Duke Nukem was another brainchild of Todd Unpronounceable, but this time it was released under the name Apogee instead of his company Scenario Software. The character's name was a matter of some confusion early on. It's spelled as Duke Nukem here because the developers realised there was a character in Captain Planet already called Duke Nukem and changed their spelling so they wouldn't get into conflicts. Later on they found there wasn't a trademark conflict after all, and so they reverted to the original spelling. While we're on that subject, I know I say his name Duke like a jukebox, but you say it Duke like the noise an otter makes, so frankly I think I have the high ground here. In the far-off future year of 1997, the largest city on Earth is under the rule of the robot army of Dr. Proton, the stage name of Dr. Blundervich. After all attempts to reach the Doctor's hideout have failed, Duke Nukem is sent in, but it's not clear if he's actually been hired by anyone or if he's just a passerby who happens to own a large plasma gun and a giant ego. He has to pursue Dr. Proton underground, to the moon, and finally into the future, fighting his way through the tech bots, which include agile robots, huge pilotless helicopters, and giant pink bunnies with drums for some reason. I hadn't noticed this before putting the 2 games side by side, but Duke Nukem bears a lot of similarity to Dark Ages with its grid-based platform movement. However, this game feels a lot more polished, with a bolder style and more varied graphics, including some crates that were graciously liberated from the PC Mega Man game. Like in Dark Ages, you can upgrade your weapon throughout the game to be able to fire more rapidly, and things are kept interesting with a couple of special abilities as well, such as the boots that allow you to jump higher with a totally radical backflip, or the grappling hooks that you can use to dangle from platforms or conveyors. Again, levels are cleared by exploration rather than just fighting your way through. You have to find keys and access cards to get through the bases. One notable feature is the bonus awards that float past in the interlevel hallways in which you can save, almost reminiscent of modern-day game achievements. You get awarded these for achieving any of the 7 special tasks on each level. Knowing what these are is a privilege that's only granted to registered users with a hint sheet. There isn't any mention of them in the game's own help, but they're awarded for things like destroying all the cameras or not getting hurt. Overall, the original Duke Nukem is still quite fun, and looking back at it, there aren't really any signs of the attitude that would come to define the character in later years. I think some people might call that a bit of a mercy. Here's a genre that we haven't seen in the anthology before. In October 1991, Apogee got together with a developer called Trilobite and released a boulder-pushy puzzle game called Paganitsu. It's the sequel to an earlier game called Chaganitsu, which was written by the same author but was published by Softdisk in 1990, at about the same time that the group there that would form id Software were secretly inventing Commander Keen. At this stage I feel I should start a diagram of who worked with whom and all the relationships between the groups that made these games, but I think it would require 4 dimensions to draw in and then come to life and devour everyone very quickly. In Paganitsu, you take the role of Alabama Smith, who they go out of their way to say is no relation to Nevada Smith, the intrepid and frequently dead explorer from George Broussard's games. They just thought up similar names by using the formula that I explained in the last video. You're exploring the titular pyramid to seek the treasures that lie within, and you have to avoid enemies, collect keys, and push an enormous amount of boulders around in order to make it through each episode's 20 levels. Particularly with Dark Ages still in mind, it's very welcome that the 3 episodes of this game are so distinct from each other. For a start, unlike all the games so far but Commander Keen, the episodes actually have different title screens. They also have completely different sets of graphics, making it feel like they really are 3 separate chapters rather than an elongation and retooling of just one. Along the way, you'll encounter surprisingly elaborate cutscenes, making this the first Apogee game to have a plot that really unfolds as you go, and it's much more of a part of the game than you might expect given the game's simple premise. I would guess that the game's conclusion is at least 15 minutes long, an unheard of amount of time until Hideo Kojima waltzed in and went cutscene mad in the late 90s, although a lot of that time is spent waiting for the painfully slow unskippable text. The storytelling doesn't quite seem to know how to play itself. The plot concerns ancient evil, sacrifice and murder and is generally dark, but simultaneously is about the release of a god called Oh My Gosh whose chaotic revenge includes raising the price of cinema concessions and making Dan Quayle run for president. There's something you may notice I've been competing with in the background here, and I'm finally going to bring it up. The absolutely infuriating plink 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 noise that plays constantly as you move from square to square. You're not missing out on a whole lot by turning the sound completely off, because you only get PC speaker twibbles anyway, but I'm surprised that nobody felt that the incessant movement sound was worth taking out. A few screens in on each episode, the puzzles start ranging from irritating to sadistic, including this grotesque incomprehensible one-way labyrinth, and some push boulder mazes which I hate because I can't do them. There's also a pointless life limit, which only serves to annoy slightly when you forget to save your game at the start of a level. But flaws aside, Paganitsu was a surprise. I went in expecting a fairly faceless puzzle game, but got one of the best presented games from the collection so far. Overall, I think the presentation is rather better than the actual game, even though it could definitely have benefited from music to enhance the atmosphere they were going for, but it shows how games of the time were already evolving into larger experience than the voiceless single-screen platform games that were being released just the previous year. This next title, however, is unusual in deliberately evoking a retro feel even for 1991. Jumpman Lives! Was a remake of Jumpman, which had originally been written by Randy Glover for the Atari, and it was made for Apogee by Shamusoft Designs. It contains all the levels of the original game and a few more besides. Unfortunately, shortly after it was released, Apogee were informed that nobody had actually asked for permission to remake the game, so at the publisher Epix's request, they were later forced to discontinue and abandon it. For this reason, it doesn't appear in the anthology. Around the same time, the author Dave Sharpless was also in a bit of trouble with Williams Electronics for his release of Joust VGA, another unlicensed remake of somebody else's game. There's something to be said here for learning from your mistakes. Jumpman is a man who is aptly named because he can jump, but that's about where his special powers end. If touched by floating white pixels, or if he falls more than 4 inches, he will immediately have a heart attack and collapse. The game is somewhat modelled after Donkey Kong, and there is apparently a plot, but it bears so little resemblance to anything that goes on in the game that it isn't really worth mentioning. Your objective is to jump and climb around the levels, collecting the dots and avoiding various enemies in order to get to the next one. If you lose all your lives, Saturn explodes. What's striking about Jumpman Lives is just how different it looks from every other Apogee game. Even though the games we've talked about so far were made by separate groups of people, they tended to at least have superficial similarities, but Jumpman Lives is done in a distinct sort of demo scene style with palette cycling and a bitmap font. Speaking of which, this is the first ever Apogee game to support the next graphics standard VGA, a 256 colour mode that makes these colours and gradients that you see in the menu possible. Therefore, it seems a strange choice to have kept so close to the simple original Atari graphics in-game. Jumpman Lives is a competent conversion, but it's slightly baffling that it exists. Among the original Apogee games, it feels strangely out of place, and I'm not sure they really knew what they were doing either with the whole not getting permission issue. Perhaps Apogee would have branched out into more game remakes had their experience with this gone well, but unfortunately, it didn't. Crystal Caves was originally another MicroFX game, but during its development, George Broussard dissolved the company and became Scott Miller's partner at Apogee instead, taking the game across with him. Like many Apogee games, it's a side-on platformer, and it uses the smooth scrolling pioneered by Commander Keen, but it has a different style to it. All the levels are only 2 screens wide and tall, making the game feel more like a slightly larger single-screen platformer, such as Jumpman or the Nevada Smith games with rooms and passageways folded around each other to fit into the available space. In some ways, it feels a bit like Spelunky might have got some inspiration from here for the underground treasure collecting setting and particularly the snake enemies. As explained in the game's introduction, you play as Milo Steamwits, a down-on-his-luck space explorer stroke entrepreneur floating from one harebrained get-rich-quick scheme to the next. In order to fund his various startups, he takes his barely functional spacecraft to the Altarian system to gather precious jewels from the dangerous Crystal Caves, and the objective is to collect all the gems from each level before reaching the exit. The game chooses not to say why gathering hundreds of jewels several times the size of Milo's generously proportioned head doesn't make him adequately rich already before blowing it all on some triple farm or attempt to set up a space resort. Your net worth is shown in the bottom left of the screen, but perhaps inflation has got quite serious in the future. The idea of a map screen makes a return here, but in the form of a side-on level rather than a separate overhead view. In general, you can enter the levels in any order you choose, although there are a couple of places where you have to complete one of the doors before being able to walk beyond it. Each level gives you 3 lives before you have to go back to the beginning, and you have unlimited tries across the game, although your ammunition count does follow you between levels, so it's important not to waste it too much. Level difficulty is varied. Some are fairly straightforward, but others are a lot more complicated, so you can put aside any particularly challenging or tedious ones for later. The game has a large number of different enemies and environments, and a few optional subtasks per level, like collecting the bonus letters from the various eggs scattered around, or finding the key to open chests. But through 48 levels across 3 episodes, gathering all the crystals from each level can get a little repetitive. They really have done their best to keep the game interesting though, and many levels have special properties such as temporary or permanent reversed gravity, falling rocks which in an attention to detail I absolutely love do not appear when you're at the top of the level, and many more. Crystal Caves is a nice evolution of the platform puzzle games that MicroFX started with the Nevada Smith series. It's difficult, particularly in the rooms which you can shoot the air generator and lose all your lives instantly, but the levels are bite-sized and it's fun to dip into. And finally, 1991 saw a sequel to Commander Keen from id Software and another story called Goodbye Galaxy, released almost exactly 1 year after the first trilogy. In the year between games, the Commander got a significant upgrade with a new look using semi-isometric graphics to give the levels a sense of depth. It has to be one of the best looking EGA games I've ever seen, and I really couldn't believe that it only had 16 colours when I went back to it. It's also the first Apogee game ever to support the option to have full sound through a sound card instead of using the internal PC speaker for anything, with music by the soon-to-be legendary Bobby Prince. The game works in much the same way as the original trilogy. You have a large world map in which you explore vast and varied levels with the aid of your trusty pogo stick, collecting keys to open doors, which this time come in the form of coloured gems, and zapping enemies with your new and more humane weapon, the stun pistol. The variety of levels on offer really is spectacular, from stone villages to the inside of pyramids and strange structures made out of glass or crystals. Each one has its own appearance and personality. And the selectable difficulty levels don't just change the number of lives you start with or how much damage you do. If you're playing on hard mode, there will be more enemies and more traps will be active, making them real separate challenges. In all these difficulties, Keen only has 1 hit before he loses a life and is sent back to the world map, and these aren't just 2-minute long levels like Crystal Caves, therefore the ability to save at any time is a real boost to playability. You can tell that the game has been made with a lot of care and attention to how it plays, something you'd expect from the id Software group. The game is also chock full of secrets and hidden passages. I remember exploring every single suspicious dead end and slightly different pattern ceiling on the shareware version when I was younger, and I still don't think I discovered everything in the game. There's even a super hard secret level, which you can discover by carefully picking apart the cryptic clues in the help file, or alternatively stumble upon it by accident. Secret of the Oracle, the shareware episode, marked another defining moment for Apogee, as it was the game that invented the dopefish. He's a horrifying buck-toothed gigantic green creature who appears in the underwater levels, often heading straight for you. Drawn by Tom Hall and voiced by Joe Ziegler with the aid of a giant bottle of Diet Coke, the Piscine grotesquerie quickly developed his own fan following and still has a page devoted to him at dopefish.com. He would later make guest appearances in many other games in the future, and not just from Apogee and Friends. It even made it into The Sims 4 and the new Deus Ex game. There were just 2 episodes this time, 1 shareware and 1 extra one that you got for registering, and unfortunately, like the first trilogy, the concluding episode is a bit of a disappointment. The first of the episodes is set on an alien planet and has a collection of really unique and interesting environments, while the second is much shorter and set entirely on a spaceship with just a couple of angular tile sets, and nowhere near as much personality as the shareware version. Two other Commander Keen games were released outside the original trilogy and the second bilogy, but they weren't published by Apogee and so they don't appear in the anthology. Keen Dreams for soft disk and Aliens Ate My Babysitter for form gen. Keen Dreams in particular is worth a look for replacing the laser pistol with a set of bouncing grenades that temporarily transform enemies into flowers with dopey faces, although neither quite reached the high bar that the shareware episode of Goodbye Galaxy set. No Game Boy Advance version was ever made.